As designers, both UX and UI, we know that visual design is important for so many reasons. Visual design is the first impression that a product makes on the user. When considering the design for your product, it is important to keep in mind that the science of vision can impact the design of digital products that have a visual element to them. So today we're going to talk about the two behavioral design principles associated with vision and design. Number one, the mere exposure effect. As designers, we would love to create websites and apps that are fresh and disruptive. But because of how our brains respond unconsciously to certain things, there are a few things to keep in mind before we decide to take this approach for every project. In particular, there is a principle called the mere exposure effect that explains that we have a tendency to prefer certain things simply because we are familiar with them. This is why it is also known as the familiarity principle. This is rooted in interesting evolutionary science, which explains that if we have been exposed to something and have survived it, it's considered safe. Our brain recognizes this and exhibits a preference for it. So thanks to the mere exposure effect, we find familiar things, be it people, objects, environments, and even design patterns comforting. A few instances where we could utilize the mere exposure effect is by designing consistent buttons, patterns, flows, and calls to action. As an example, consider how certain apps like Spotify achieve consistency in their visual identity and in how they present their CTA throughout, which is upgrade to premium. Or even how a common interaction like logging into an app or searching for a product that you frequently buy could feel better in terms of usability and satisfaction because it's a familiar process for us. Now, it's important to remember that this does not mean that we can't get creative and innovative with our designs. It just means that when we come up with new ideas for our designs, we just have to consider biases like the exposure effect to ensure that we introduce these new concepts in the best possible way for our users. Number two, effects of fonts on behaviors. So the next thing I want to talk about is some interesting research conducted about people's perceptions and behaviors when they're presented text and fonts in a certain way. For a brief context, in the timeline of human development, we have to remember that reading is a relatively new cognitive process. It is speculated that while we may have started talking around 100,000 BC, we may have only started to slowly read around 6,000 BC. This all just lends itself to the fact that reading is a pretty complex cognitive process that has developed over time. And studies have uncovered some interesting conscious and unconscious processes associated with reading. In particular, it has been observed that when it comes to the line length when reading, people prefer a shorter line length, but read faster with a longer line length. It's a bit of a paradox where we prefer one thing, but perform better with something else. So in web design, we have to carefully consider the context of use and sometimes make a trade-off. We could try to engage people by using a shorter line length, knowing that it might take them longer, or use a longer line length where there's a lot of content, even though people may not find it preferable. Another interesting study conducted by Song and Schwartz found that when people were shown instructions for an exercise routine in two different types of fonts, the exercise routine itself was perceived in very different ways. In the first instance, the instructions were presented in a pretty standard, easy-to-read font. In the second instance, the same instructions were presented in a decorative and therefore somewhat difficult to read font. When these participants were asked to estimate how long it would take to actually perform the exercise routine, the participants who read the instructions in the decorative font anticipated that it would take them almost twice as long to perform the exercise. And this is in comparison to the people who read the instructions in the easy-to-read font, who anticipated the same exercise taking a lot less time to perform. In a design context, this indicates that if we present information in a way that's hard to read or difficult to process, our users are going to think that it's hard to do. And this could mean that our users are going to be a lot less willing to go through a flow or process that they deem to be too hard. This is because our brains can unconsciously attribute the difficulty of reading the content as a signal that the process or experience itself is hard. So if we want our users to have a simple and easy experience with our product and be willing to adopt new behaviors, it's important that we consider how we present information to them. There we have it. These are two important ways that vision and design can have an impact on the way our users experience our products.